In this episode, I am going to explain how to identify worse pieces and in which order to improve them. So what happens is, in many of the times, some of our pieces are not well placed in our game. And at those moments, it's extremely important that we quickly sense that some of my pieces are not well placed and I have to do something about it quickly. Okay? So now I'm going to teach you how to identify if your piece is not well placed, because if you know what to look for, then it is easy to find it. Okay? So let's take an example where we have white bishop on g2 and white rook on f1. Okay? Now the rook is very active because it is having an open file. The bishop is also very active because it's in an open diagonal. But let's imagine now I am bringing a white pawn and keeping it on f3. Okay? Now what happens to this bishop and rook? They become passive because the bishop's diagonal and the rook's file, they are blocked by our own pawn. Okay? So the first principle we can learn is, if our pieces are blocked by our own pawns, they become passive. Okay? Now similar situation, let's have white bishop on g2 and white rook on e1. Now again the rook and bishop are active, but let's keep a pawn on e4. Okay, the pawn on e4, it's blocking the bishop and the rook, but compared to the previous situation where we had the pawn on f3 and rook f1, this is slightly better because now bishop has an extra square and the rook also has two squares in front of it before the pawn blocks the path. So this is slightly better than the previous example. Now let's push it further. The third position with bishop g2, rook d1 and pawn d5. Okay? So this is still the rook and the bishop are passive, but they are not as worse as the first situation where we had rook f1, bishop g2 with pawn on f3. But the overall principle we can learn is, if our pieces are restricted by our own pawns, then those pieces become passive. Okay? So this is the first thing you have to keep in mind. Now let's go to the next position where we have bishop on g2, rook on f1. This time I am keeping a knight on f3 instead of a pawn. And what happens in this case as well, the bishop and rook are blocked by the knight, but it is not as bad as the situation where we had the pawn. Okay? Because earlier if the pawn had been blocked, then these pieces will remain passive for long. But now all we have to do is just move the knight away, let's say knight d4 or knight e5, and then immediately these two pieces become active. But we must realize that even in the case where our pieces are blocked by our own piece, they become passive. Okay? So let's do the same thing again, push it one file to the left. We have bishop g2, rook e1, knight e4.